In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do an observational painting using watercolors. Start by picking your objects. Once you have your objects, you're going to be using a light box to draw them and then trace them onto the correct sort of paper. To those students who are doing the activity with me, you know that we're doing multiple versions on different types of paper, which is why we're using a light box. But even if you're doing different activities, it's important. You want to set up your space. Make sure with watercolor that you always tape down with masking tape to ensure that there's as little warping as possible as you're working. With watercolor, it's really important that not only do you tape it down and have your colors and brushes with you, but you should also make sure that you have 2 jars of water. You'll see that one of the jars is quite dirty by the end of the painting and the other one is not so dirty. You do that because one of the jars will be for cleaning your dirty brush and the other will be for ensuring you have cleanish water to get the purest colors possible. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my background, just using some light washes of some beige colors in this case. The table in the image that I'm using is imitation wood, and so I'm going to try to create that effect somewhat, and then for the background I just use a light beige, just because I don't want to actually draw the big mess that's in the background of the photograph that I took of my objects for reference. Now I'm using the Derwent Inktense Paint Pan set, which is a lovely sort of watercolor to use. It's permanent, they're vibrant colors, and you really only just need a little bit of water to activate those colors and you get some great hues. So I'm applying the shadows that my bottles have cast. I'm just blocking in everything lightly now, but I just want to make sure there's no bright white spots except the ones I intend by the end of my painting. That's why I'm making sure I do something in the background. Even though it is quite light, it is practically the color of the masking. You can see with a wash that I'm applying a very light coat of the watercolor. That requires me to mix in a great deal of water on my palette with the color to ensure that it comes out very light, very subtle. I don't want it to be too intense, especially as I'm still learning how to use this particular set of watercolor paints and I don't know how they're going to dry. Now right now if you look, the strokes in the wood seem quite dark, but they're actually going to dry a little bit lighter by the end of this process. You don't always know how that's going to go. Now this light wash, I'm going to make sure that I'm applying not just in my background, but I'm going to do that for the bottles as well. So you can see that I'm blending in a great deal of water into my bottles, but it's still quite bright. I was expecting it to lighten a little bit more as I pulled my brush along. So to solve that problem, after applying the wash, I take a paper towel and I just dab on it to pull up some of the excess ink and moisture. Alright, I'm going to do the same thing with the next bottle that's of a darker blue color. But you'll see that because I don't get quite as light as I was expecting, although it is lighter, I am going to do the same thing and I'm going to dab it with a paper towel just to pick up the excess color. The next thing you want to do as you're working with watercolors is start building in your values. So in this case, I'm going to be using various blues and purples to build in the various dark spots onto this bottle. Since I've already done the lightest spot, I want to try to build in some of the darker spots to give a little shape to it. This is where those implicit and explicit contour lines that I drew come in handy. One of the reasons I haven't erased my lines to a lighter tone is to allow you guys to see these lines and understand why I'm blocking in certain colors in certain areas. Usually before you start painting with watercolor, you take a rubber eraser and you roll out some of those dark lines so they're not quite as intense. But I'm leaving them in place so that I remember where to put my lines very clearly, but more so that I can show you guys, because if I had erased them, you wouldn't see why I'm putting these dark patches in specific areas to create the shape of this bottle, trying to achieve that round perspective on the top of the bottle to actually make it look like the shoulders of the bottle. It's easier to do so if I know where the darker areas are coming and where the lighter areas should be, so I can try to maintain those. I'm going to do the same thing on the next bottle, okay, paying attention to where the deepest shadows are versus where the lighter highlights are, building those in progressively through darker and darker layers. It's really important with watercolor that you don't oversaturate your page with too much water. So periodically in the video you see little breaks happen because I've left things to dry for a few minutes before coming back. Alternatively, if you don't have time to let things dry, you can always use a heat gun to help dry things a little bit faster if need be. So once I've built in all my values, I'm going to start glazing in my other colors. So in this case, I've realized that the turquoise that I've used for the one bottle is not quite green enough. It's too blue heavy, so I've done a wash of green over top of it to get the color more accurate to the lighting situation within the room. Now I'm going to start building in the shadows on the tin can, or paint can rather. And so building in the sort of silvery hues of that shiny paint can that's coated with white paint dripping down the sides of it. So I'm using layers of gray as I'm doing that, but it's also a little bit old and it's going to need some brown rusty colors. You can see that I'm going to use that same brown color in other areas to develop shadows so it doesn't just appear in a single area. All of the objects in my paintings should have hints of the same color just so that it looks more cohesive because everything reflects off each other. So the shadows will be similar, there'll be light bouncing from one object to the other. So you'll see as I paint this, I'll add a little bit of that purple color to the tin can, even though it doesn't make sense for it to be there. It does because it's the reflection of the purple glass onto the silver, just as you can see the tin can being reflected onto the purple bottle itself. Now right now I've added in a very dark value, and you can see as I zoom in, what I do is I switch to a dry brush and I build that out to create the effects on the tin can itself. With watercolor, you don't have to purely use a wet brush. If you apply some color, you can switch to a dry brush and blend it out. And here I use my fingers as well to try to get the tones just right. Now that most of the painting is blocked in and everything's in the correct area, I'm starting to work on the finer details to ensure that everything has as much detail as it needs to really define it within space, but also improving the contrast in some areas to make things really pop, adding in textures. You can see now that I'm really pushing the contrast to make sure that bottle really stands out. But with every layer of watercolor, because it is transparent, it just builds on the layers beforehand. So any mistake you make in the process will show up in the end, just it might be a little bit more subtle by that point.